History is a prism used by laymen to explain away certain theories or ideas in order to help him better understand the modern world. And a good example of this is when Hernando Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire with an army of professional conquistadors or soldiers, when in reality, he led a small ragtag group of volunteers and adventurers and was able to cobble together a coalition of thousands of native Mesoamericans who were simply opposed to Montezuma and the Aztecs to overthrow Montezuma in the city of Teotihuacan. Moreover, we in the West are seen as the sort of evil throughout the world due to our desire to have global domination through the use of imperial practices. And a good example of this is how Cortez dominated Mesoamerica, forcing the natives to become effectively serfs on large estates, which would pay tribute then of some kind to him and the Spanish crown. And in reality, Cortez simply replaced the Aztec ruler and largely maintained the economic status quo that the Aztecs had created prior to his arrival. We see the same myth-making bad habits plague institutions up to and including the Special Forces Regiment. I want to first identify some crucial narratives that curse the regiment to this day. According to the official US Army website, quote, "The primary mission of Special Forces is to clandestinely train and lead small populations in unconventional warfare." But is it true? Are Special Forces the undisputed masters of UW? And if so, what evidence is there to support this narrative or this mission set? Now, if you were ever in Special Forces, you for sure had conversations about how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan corrupted the regiment in terms of what SF was originally intended to do and how important it is that we shift away from the sort of counter-terror, counterinsurgency missions and move back or migrate back towards UW or unconventional warfare operations. Now, very often I've heard platitudes such as, quote, "We're not shooters or door kickers. If that's what you wanted to do, you're in the wrong place." Another one that I hear is SF doesn't do direct action missions and isn't supposed to, nor were they intended to, and therefore we have to get back to our UW roots. Eventually, I ask these individuals who are typically Special Forces officers or older NCOs, what are our UW roots that they're referring to? And they go on to claim that SF was conducting UW missions in Vietnam and during the invasion of Afghanistan using ODA 555 and 595, who worked with the Northern Alliance to defeat and overthrow the Taliban. Now, I've had some version of this conversation at least a dozen times since 2010. As you can see, they're using the history to justify their argument. Special Forces was created historically to do UW, and we did it once upon a time in a faraway place, and we should simply return to that place. But according to the regiment's history, these individuals either don't know what UW is or are completely ignorant of Special Forces history. Now, if I had to take a guess, it's the latter, considering most of these uptight individuals that can regurgitate the UW definition verbatim, but rarely, if ever, bother to pick up a book and read it in any analytical way. So let's see what history has to say about the matter. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society. Now, I'm guessing at this point you're asking yourself, if you're not from Special Forces, what is UW? What is unconventional warfare? And moreover, how is it any different than irregular or asymmetrical warfare? Well, lucky for us, and the US Army, and in particular JSOC, are litigious, making painstaking efforts to study and understand UW, counterinsurgency, and asymmetrical warfare generally. The best news for nerds like us is that they publish multiple volumes on the subject matter. Based on the extensive research conducted by the ARIS project, and ARIS simply stands for Assessing Revolutionary and Insurgent Strategies, under the direction of Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, and sponsored by USASOC, the following is a synthesized and academically grounded definition of unconventional warfare, again, also known as UW, that reflects their analytical framework. Quote, "Unconventional warfare is the use of military and non-military means by an external actor to enable, support, or exploit a resistance movement or insurgency in order to coerce, disrupt, or overthrow a governing authority, typically within a denied or politically sensitive environment. It involves the deliberate integration of political, psychological, economic, and military tools, and is conducted primarily by, with, or through indigenous or surrogate forces. Unconventional warfare emphasizes the manipulation of existing socio-political fractures and mobilization of civilian populations, rather than the direct application of conventional military forces. Now, before diving into the SF's history, let's quickly go over some key elements here. So number one, external support. UW relies on an external sponsor, which is often a state actor, providing material, advisory, and organizational structure assistance to the resistance movement or the insurgency. Number two is the irregular forces. Execution is carried out through guerrilla fighters, underground networks, and auxiliary civilian components. Third is political warfare. Political legitimacy, narrative control, and ideological alignment are as crucial as kinetic operations. Phased approach. Operations typically follow a progression: preparation, infiltration, organization, buildup, employment, and transition, as identified by the Eris Doctrine. Denial and plausibility. The sponsor often maintains plausible deniability, as operations typically occur in contested or denied areas without open declarations of war. 6, strategic effects. The aim is to create strategic leverage over an adversary by destabilizing internal governance and exploiting vulnerabilities through indirect means. Now, if all of this seems a bit overwhelming and confusing, and I remember the first time I was learning this stuff, I was totally fucking lost in the sauce, I'm going to tell you a story that will hopefully illuminate these concepts. And just for the sake of having a little bit of fun, I'm not going to use the common narrative of the US effort in the French resistance vis-a-vis the OSS in World War II, although that is indeed a good example. An individual named Rear Admiral Milton E. Miles of the US Navy played a pivotal and largely unrecognized role in pioneering unconventional warfare and intelligence operations in China during World War II. As the US Navy's chief liaison to Chinese forces, Miles helped organize one of the most complex and covert resistance networks in the war, operating under the Office of Strategic Services, also known as the OSS, and in partnership with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government. In the spring of 1942, as Japanese forces tightened their grip across East Asia, a quiet American naval officer stepped off a transport in Chongqing, the smoke-choked wartime capital of China. His name was Captain Milton E. Miles, and his orders were as murky as the river mists that curled along the Yangtze. Officially, he was sent to assist the Chinese in setting up weather stations to support U.S. naval operations in the Pacific. Unofficially, his mission was far more daring: to help organize a guerrilla war behind Japanese lines, a secret war of sabotage, espionage, and indeed insurgency. Miles found an unlikely partner in General Dai Lai, the feared head of Chiang Kai-shek's secret police, known to the Chinese as the Himmler of China. Dai Lai was as ruthless as he was effective. Together, they formed the Sino-American Cooperation Organization, also known as SACO, a joint Chinese-American effort to take the fight to the Japanese in ways no conventional army could. From muddy training camps hidden in rice paddies of southern China, Miles and a cadre of U.S. Navy officers trained thousands of Chinese guerrillas, handpicked from local militias, criminals, and peasant fighters. The recruits were more than effective as Miles and his team led them into combat. Their sabotage techniques, specifically how to blow up rail lines with homemade charges, derail trains, and ambush Japanese convoys from the shadows of the jungle. Miles' men operated far from the safety of American bases. They traveled light, spoke passable Chinese, and lived with the partisans they trained. His unit was a hybrid, part commando team, part spy ring, part meteorological bureau. While bombs exploded in the countryside, SACO agents quietly transmitted weather data from remote hilltops, providing vital information to help plan air raids and naval engagements in the Pacific. The results were staggering. SACO trained guerrillas reportedly destroyed over 230 bridges, derailed 84 Japanese trains, and killed or wounded tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. They sowed chaos in the enemy's rear while the war raged in the skies and seas within the Pacific. But this alliance came at a price. Miles often found himself clashing with General William Donovan and the OSS, who resented SACO's independence. The relationship between Dai Lai's brutal security service and the democratic ideals Miles represented was uneasy at best. Yet, Miles, even the pragmatist, focused on results. Every bridge blown, every train wrecked, every Japanese battalion stranded in the wilderness brought the Allies closer to victory. When the war ended in 1945, SACO disbanded quietly. No ticker tape parades, no medals on the national television sets. Miles returned home with little fanfare. His achievements buried in classical reports and diplomatic tension. Yet his legacy, it lingered. He had proven something vital, that a small, dedicated force working with, by, and through indigenous resistance fighters could outmatch a much larger army in terrain too complex for conventional warfare. Here, for example, are just some of SACO's broader impacts across the Indo-Pacific theater. Firstly, intelligence gathering. SACO's intelligence operations were critical in understanding Japanese movements and vulnerability. This information was then passed to the American military, contributing to strategic planning in the Pacific theater. 2. Sabotage and guerrilla warfare. SACO worked alongside Chinese forces to carry out sabotage missions that disrupted the Japanese supply lines and military operations deep behind enemy lines in occupied China. This helped weaken Japanese control over the region and diverted resources that would otherwise have been used on the front lines against the US forces in the Pacific. 3. Training Chinese forces. The United States provided training to Chinese forces in modern warfare techniques, including sabotage, guerrilla tactics, which helped them resist Japanese advances within China. And just as a side note, in the long term, the US ended up helping the communists, which would tragically and inevitably be used against them in Vietnam. But that's just like a totally different story. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it's worth noting. The diplomatic impact. SACO also helped strengthen the US-China alliance during the war, fostering cooperation between the two nations. This was significant as China was one of the major allied powers fighting against Japan, and SACO's efforts were vital in maintaining that alliance. Now, while SACO's efforts were relatively small in scale compared to major military operations in the Pacific, they played an important role in the broader context of the war by tying together intelligence, guerrilla warfare, and diplomatic cooperation in the fight against Imperial Japan. Now, in summary, SACO, under the leadership of Milton E. Miles, contributed significantly to the success of Allied operations in the Pacific theater. It was part of a broader strategy to support China and weaken Japanese positions through unconventional warfare, intelligence, and cooperation. In the annals of American unconventional warfare, Rear Admiral Milton E. Miles remains a pioneer, a man who waged a secret war in one of the world's most dangerous theaters, and won not with armies, but with insurgents, spies, sabotage. Okay, so now that we understand or have a solid understanding of what UW is and what it looks like, let's now examine the history of Special Forces Green Berets in detail. As we press on, I want to use kind of another anecdotal story of another special operations mission to sort of highlight the reality that none of what we are about to discuss is new. And moreover, this ancient history will illuminate and help us understand the global military ecosystem in the post-World War II era, which indeed gave rise to Green Berets. 2,500 years ago, the Spartans and the Athenians led their own coalitions against one another in the Peloponnesian War, which simmered at a low boil for decades previously. This conflict started as a Cold War in the early 5th century. The unified Greek coalition that had defeated the Persians was now sort of in the wake. There was a power vacuum, and Athenians and Spartans found themselves at the top of this pyramid. The two Hellenic superpowers were at odds with one another, but they also wanted to avoid confronting each other head on. So instead, they fought a low-density conflict, or multiple conflicts, indirectly all throughout the late and middle 5th century. Eventually, when a hot war broke out in the 430s BCE, Sparta would march into Attica, and the Athenians would hide behind their long walls, refusing to come out and face them head on. Instead, Athens deployed their navy and executed hit-and-run strikes and raids all around the Peloponnese, avoiding, like I said, that face-to-face confrontation with their Spartan enemies. This is indeed a form of irregular warfare. They quickly made headway creating alliances with the Messenians, which were the peoples who made up the Helot or serf population to the west of Laconia, where the Spartans resided. Messenia was Spartan-occupied territory, much like China when in World War II with the Japanese. It was a perfect region for Athens to conduct a UW operation. They trained, armed, and led Messenian hoplites against the Spartan occupiers throughout the war and were rather successful, forcing the Spartans to expend energy not just abroad, but at home. All of this rings similar, or is not so dissimilar, from Milton E. Miles in China against the Japanese. And although the Spartans' high command wasn't interested in executing an irregular war against the Athenians, there was one Spartan who decided they had run out of options. He knew this would not be a traditional or conventional war, but a war fought in the shadows. The Spartan commander's name was Brasidas, and he raised a mercenary army and single-handedly led a UW mission in northern Greece, slipping into Athens' allied Greek city-states at night, often with the use of spies or partisans, and rallied the peoples there to join his cause against the tyrannical Athenians. For the most part, he avoided confronting the Athenian army in pitched battle and only attacked when it was most advantageous for him and his paramilitary force. Brasidas' success showed that traditional conservative Spartans that wars could be fought by other means. By using one or two Spartans as advisors, they could then lead an army of allies, guerrillas, or mercenaries and defeat the Athenians. With this new strategy, they could deploy more forces and have a larger impact within the battle space. Now, the lesson to be learned from the Peloponnesian War is in the aftermath of a huge global conflict like World War II and or the Persian Wars. There is inherently a power vacuum in its wake. Due to the tragedy in the post-conflict world, the remaining superpowers seek to avoid further conflict, but simultaneously must respond to a potential looming threat of equal size and power. Instead of an all-out war, these state actors conduct low-level conflicts in the peripheries in an attempt to weaken their enemy. This is exactly what happened between Athens and Sparta, as well as the Soviet Union and the United States. In the aftermath of World War II, and with the inception of the Green Berets, you were going to hear an echo from the distant Greek past. After World War II, the new regime or political movement that was the obvious threat to the US was indeed the Soviet Union. Again, not so dissimilar from the end of the Persian War and the inherent rise of Athens and Sparta within Greece. One was a democracy, the other was an oligarchy, and both saw each other ways of governance in opposition with one another, much like the Americans' Democratic Republic and the Soviet Union's communism. Although the Soviets didn't have nuclear capabilities yet, it was simply a matter of time, and many folks in Washington knew this fact. They also recognized the Soviets wished to increase their sphere of influence around the world, not just in Europe, but also in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. Again, Athens and Sparta wished to coalesce other Greek city-states throughout the Hellenic world into alliances to create a bulwark against both local and foreign enemies. Due to its conservative nature and dislike from being away from the Peloponnese too long, Sparta abandoned overseas missions, which let the Athenians essentially run roughshod over other Greek city-states throughout the Hellenic world, and they were completely unopposed. In the wake of World War II, the United States assumed the Soviets would begin to invade Europe using conventional forces. The US sought to undermine Soviet efforts to spread communism by using a special operations force to conduct UW like the OSS had done in Europe during World War II. Charles M. Simpson, in his book Inside the Green Berets, writes this, quote, "Special Forces' highly secret mission was to exploit the resistance potential behind the Iron Curtain in the event of the expected Russian invasion of Western Europe. Should war break out, it was visualized that clandestine contact would be established with resistance groups. Upon their agreement, small teams of special forces would be infiltrated to join them, help them organize and train, call for equipment by radio, and try to guide and influence their activities so as to enhance the overall war effort." In 1952, while the 82nd Airborne pursued traditional training, the Army stood up a psychological warfare center. Colonel Aaron Bank was assigned there in April of 1952. Now, despite all the success of the OSS operatives had during World War II, special operations was still seen at this time as an ungentlemanly way to wage war, hiding in the shadows, conducting raids, ambushes, and assassination missions, rather than facing the enemy head on. Because of all this, the Army and the Pentagon kept the unit a secret, which was the right move. All special operations units require they require a clandestine aura. Without compartmentalization and secrecy, the operations are doomed to fail, particularly a UW mission. On June 20th, 1952, Bank stood up 10th Special Forces Group, which included 10 men whose backgrounds ranged from OSS operators, rangers, and even a few paratroopers. Ultimately, their goal was to support resistance movements vis-a-vis UW in various countries the Soviets were presumably going to invade and occupy in order to spread communism. As the regiment took shape, they weeded out soldiers who were not qualified or didn't have the right personality for the job. Again, according to Simpson, quote, "The bums and phonies were weeded out, and those who had come for the wrong reasons left because the demands were too great." Maintaining accountability and carving off the fat, as we like to say, is critical in every special operations unit. There must be incentives to ensure that the only individuals that remain on the ODA are commando types that are ready, willing, and capable to execute a variety of special operations missions. In his book Snake Eater, Don Bendel, a Special Forces Vietnam veteran, recalls a moment during a pre-deployment training mission where the captain of the ODA was clearly unfit to lead his team and was relieved of his duty on the spot. As time has progressed into the modern era, it has become increasingly more difficult to relieve Special Forces soldiers of duty and revoke their Special Forces tab, which has become a large hindrance on the unit's capabilities and lethality writ large. However, in other special operations units like Ranger Regiment and like Delta, if a soldier fails to meet the standard or presents behaviors that are not in line with the unit's requirements or culture, they are booted. The maintenance of standards is critical in any military force, but this is especially true in special operations. Okay, so these early FA teams, which were the predecessors to the ODAs or Operational Detachment Alphas, were manned by 15 members, including 2 officers. The FA teams trained irregular warfare while also demanding that each member cross-train vigorously with one another, even though each team member had a specialty. So, for example, because communications were so important and still are to this day, each member of the team had to be proficient in setting up an antenna, assemble a radio set, encode a message, and send that message vis-a-vis Morse code at no less than eight words per minute. The team was expected to make do with minimal supplies and were familiarized with foreign equipment and weapons due to the nature of UW operations. And the reality is that resupply is difficult, if often impossible, during these missions. It was not uncommon, for example, for OSS operatives or Milton to use native weapons, clothing, and equipment. According to Simpson, training for officers, team sergeants, and intel sergeants consisted of, quote, tactics, techniques, operations, planning, intelligence, starting with the conventional and progressing to the irregular and dirty tricks. It covered raids and ambushes, guerrilla organizations, the selection, marking, organization, and sterilization of airdrop and landing zones, underground operations, kidnapping and assassination operations, escape and evasion intelligence nets, agent selection and handling, fingerprint identification, counterintelligence, and security. Another key feature of these irregular commandos was that they had to be instructors as well and have the capacity to effectively teach their guerrillas and native counterparts on the use of weapons, communications, first aid, and small unit tactics, among other skills and competencies. By November of 1953, Bank was ready to put his 782 Special Operations Commandos to the test. They deployed to Germany to conduct irregular warfare training and war games against other U.S. Army conventional units using local nationals as their partner G-Force. Now, for those of you who went to Robin Sage, this is like Robin Sage on steroids. Instead of facing various role players, the OGSF guys were waging a very active war game against a highly trained and highly skilled U.S. military over roughly a 3,000 square mile area. As they continued these training exercises in Europe, they discovered just how much of a boon they were in learning their strengths, weaknesses, and how to decisively execute an unconventional warfare mission. Their UW Robin Sage training endeavors began to expand not just in Europe, but also into places like Iran, Turkey, Greece, and other various locations. The expansion served 2 purposes. Firstly, they were able to continue their UW training exercises, honing their skills, and simultaneously they were able to evaluate and create potential future resistance fighters if indeed the Soviets attempted to push into any one of these various locations. By expanding their reach, they also met new challenges and had to overcome new and often difficult types of unique terrain like mountains, swamps, frozen tundras, jungles, and deserts. By the end of the 1950s, Special Forces units had established three main groups: 10th Group in Germany, 77th Group at Bragg, and 1st Group in Okinawa. In total, there were approximately 2,000 Special Operations soldiers. Now, this is where the traditional modern narrative of quote unquote what Green Berets are supposed to do based on our history goes seriously awry. One thing became perfectly clear as the 1960s rolled around. The Soviet Union was not taking the strategy that the imperial powers of World War II had used in the 1930s and in the 1940s. And instead, they decided to use another policy to spread communism, one which, looking back at the annals of Russian history, makes perfect sense. And it's amazing that military planners didn't see it coming. Instead of using shock troops in Poland and France like the Nazis, or invading China like Imperial Japan, the communist regime decided they would use rather the original method of spreading communism, which was, of course, revolution. In every country they targeted, the Soviets used the same strategy their predecessors had used during the Russian Revolution, pitting the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Special Forces Green Berets originally designed and inspired by the events of World War II, where imperial powers expanded their borders by the use of conventional forces, at which point the Allies could covertly insert these Special Forces teams or partisans that could start a revolutionary or unconventional warfare campaign against occupying powers. But by the 1960s, traditional military strategies had largely been abandoned, and instead the Soviet Union sought to start liberation revolutions as far and wide as they could, and most of the groundwork was already done for them. They began targeting countries that were usually allied with the US, but were also seriously corrupt and therefore benefited the top percentile of people, particularly landholders and politicians. And due to their corrupt practices, a Bolshevik-style revolution was perfect. And the Soviets began stirring up revolutionary movements all throughout the world within these unstable countries, which of course include Vietnam, China, Cuba, Germany, Korea, etc., and etc. Many of these countries were new and were still establishing their governments in the wake of the World War I era, or they were in complete shambles trying to put the pieces back together after World War II. But in both cases, regardless of which one you choose, were prime for a Soviet-style revolution. Simpson summarizes the situation in this way. He says, quote, "As the 1960s began in the early days of the new frontier, counterinsurgency was a new world and a new concept. Counterinsurgency was to be the answer to communist expansion and growing threats of subversion and of wars of liberation. These were the considerations that caused Special Forces to do an about-face from their original role as guerrillas towards the more difficult mission of counterinsurgency. By the early 1960s, the United States realized it didn't need an unconventional force to thwart an occupying Soviet power, but instead needed a counterinsurgency, counter-terror force or unit to disrupt and destroy communist insurgency movements throughout the globe. Lucky for the United States, Special Forces Green Berets were arguably the perfect outfit to meet this call. They had spent the last 5+ years aggressively creating UW doctrine and therefore understood what an effective counterinsurgency, counter-terror operation would and should look like. Simpson, in his book Inside the Green Berets, suggests, quote, "First, the SF troopers' guerrilla experience could be decisive in analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of enemy guerrillas. The anti-guerrilla maneuvers in Germany were now alerted to provide Special Forces advisors to the conventional aggressor commanders with chaotic results for the guerrillas. Moreover, Special Forces detachments were small, self-contained, and capable of operating independently in remote areas for extended periods of time. The teams had language capabilities and were oriented to and trained in the cultures and backgrounds of other peoples. The skills already possessed by the teams lent themselves to counterinsurgency or at least counter-guerrilla operations. Why couldn't a team developed and trained to organize and advise a guerrilla battalion not be used to organize and advise a paramilitary counter-guerrilla battalion? Here was a group of mature and motivated professionals ready and eager to help develop indigenous potential wherever it may be found. And last, the forces were not only good, but they were ready and available." Simpson noted that John F. Kennedy, a fanboy of the Special Forces Green Berets, told his SecDef Robert McNamara, quote, "We need a greater ability to deal with guerrilla forces, insurrection, and subversion." Later, he told Congress in a special message, quote, "And we must help train local forces to be equally effective." He also carried a message straight to the military establishment, counseling the 1962 graduating class at West Point that they must help their country find a way to, quote, "counter the wars of liberation." The term liberation here is a direct reference to the communist strategy of, quote unquote, liberating countries from their Western free market democratic societies in favor of a socialist communist model. In our next episode, we're going to examine the Green Beret and their role in Vietnam. Was it a UW mission, as we have been told again and again, or was it clearly and obviously a counterinsurgency and counter-terror operation through the use of targeted direct action missions by, with, and through local national partners? Stay tuned, guys. I'm Zach Masick. This is the Dead Warrior Society.